This Ben Shapiro Destiny conversation on Lex Friedman's podcast is just amazing. You guys should go watch the whole thing. I'm going to be looking at a specific portion of it that really gets to the crux of what is different about their paradigms, what is sort of overlapping, and where they can kind of concede. So they get on the topic of education, and immediately Destiny lays out some legitimate concerns. So Destiny's claim is that, hey, with things like air conditioning, with things like lunches, resources, the federal government funding these things, kids can achieve more in society. Okay, now listen to Ben Shapiro's response to this.
Priorities when it comes to education, the availability of technology is actually fairly low on the list of priorities.
Sure, the two things I've heard are food availability and I think air conditioning, I think, are the two biggest ones that I hear, but sure.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing in terms of education itself, not just the physical facilities that we're talking about, would actually be two-parent family households, communities that have fathers in them is actually the number one, decisive according to Roland Fryer and many studies done on this particular topic. And the idea that money alone, that investment of resources is the top priority in schooling is belied by the fact that LAUSD, which is where I went to school when I was younger, they pour an enormous amount of money into LAUSD, and it does not result in better schooling outcomes.
Obviously, there are different experiences based on where zip code you're in that people have with education. I grew up in Vista. I went to Vista High School. My brother and sister, they grew up in Del Mar. They went to Torrey Pines High School. Torrey Pines High School had like a 98% rate of people who graduated that went into four-year universities. And I want to say completed four-year universities, like an astronomical rate. Vista High School had like a 75% graduation rate, right? So the massive disparity, probably because of the funding to the local school through property taxes. But what Ben Shapiro points out is that the number one inclination of how students and kids will do is not how much technology they have, is not whether they have AC, is not whether they have food. It's actually the family structure, and if dads are in the community, dads are in the home, and kids are coming from a two-parent household. Destiny is saying, hey, we need more programs, we need to pour more money into schools, we need to do these things. And Ben Shapiro right out the rip says, well, you could do all of those things, but unless you fix the root of the issue of why there's so much dysfunction in society, which is broken households, you're not going to move the needle.
If I had a replicator machine from Star Trek, would I give everybody an enormous amount of stuff? Sure, I would. Every resource is finite. Every resource is limited, and you have to prioritize. Again, I think that the question is again, the chief injustice when it comes to education on the list of injustices is lack of availability to technology, or that it's a funding problem. I just don't think that's the case.
Sure, and I can half agree with you there, but I don't think any amount of changes in the schools will create two-parent households.
I totally agree with you. So that's why I think that the fundamental educational problem is not, in fact, a schooling problem. I think that it pre-exists that.
It pre-exists that. That's good.
Now, I feel like this is kind of the conservative merry-go-round where it's like, what can we do to help with schools? So two of the things that I've seen, I think, that are usually brought up in research is one is air conditioning, that children in hotter environments just don't learn as well. And then the second one is access to food. So like kids that are given like a breakfast or a lunch that's provided at school, like increases educational outcomes. Now, I agree that neither of these things might be determinative in like, well, 20% of kids were graduating and now 80% of kids are graduating. Do you think there should be like some minimum threshold or minimum baseline of like, at the very least, every school should have a non-leaky gym, or every school should have, if children can't afford lunch or breakfast, like some sort of food provided, or every school should have these like baseline things?
So again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is, how large is the margin and how big is the movement, right? So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is, what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework. What are the incentive structures we can set up for a society that actually facilitate that? How local communities take ownership of their schools is a big one. Air conditioning and lunch programs sounds great in a vacuum. In terms of prioritization of values and cost structure, are those the things that I think are going to move the needle in a major way in terms of public policy? I do not. And in fact, I think that many of them end up being disproportionate wastes of money. An enormous amount of school lunch programs are thrown out. Like an enormous amount of that food ends up in the garbage can. Is there a better way to do that? If there is a better way to do it, then I'm perfectly willing to hear about that better way to do it. But it seems to me that one of the big flaws in the way that many people of the left approach government is, what if we hit every gnat with a hammer?
Now that right there, I think is the crux of the conversation. One of the issues with folks who are approaching everything further left is like, if we hit every gnat with a hammer, then that will solve all of society's issues. Just throw money at everything. The reality is that's just not true. Throwing money at stuff is not true if you're not dealing with the root of these issues, which is what types of people are being raised up.
What if there is a much bigger substructure problem that needs to be solved in order to, if you're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, sure, you can make the Titanic slightly more balanced because the deck chairs are slightly better oriented. But the real question is the water that's gaping into the Titanic, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%.
Destiny just conceded Ben Shapiro's point. Remember, Destiny is a progressive liberal who lives an alternative lifestyle in an open, or was in an open polyamorous marriage that ended and isn't with his child's mother, just conceded that point. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Well, sure, but so like here would be the merry-go-round. I would say that like there's a minimum funding for schools that I think would help children. And then we go, well, the thing that would help them the most is two-parent households. And I go, okay, well, two-parent households actually aren't the problem. The issue is access to things like birth controls, that people don't have children early on. And it's like, but the issue isn't actually birth control. The issue is actually you need a certain amount of money to move out early and to get married and then to have a two-parent household. So it's actually like economic opportunity.
No.
Well, it's not,
No, just two-parent households.
Nope. Just two-parent households. Now watch they dig deeper into two-parent households, how much that's shifted, how much society has changed, and a lot of these issues literally coming down to two-parent households.
The vast majority of people in this country with kids used to be married. The vast majority of people with kids in this country now are not married increasingly.
But a lot of those things in terms of resting on whether or not people get married have to do with financial decisions. Do you have the money?
People are worse off now than they were 50, 60 years ago when the marriage rates were higher.
People are delaying the start of their careers because education is becoming increasingly important.
In other words, people are richer now and they have more education now, and yet they're having more babies out of wedlock now because they're richer and have more education.
I'm saying that...
Wow. From this moment, Ben just kind of just controls the entire conversation because he just reinstates the questions, right? So people get more education, they make more money, but they have more kids out of wedlock. Make it make sense. It doesn't make sense. Who says that you can't get married while pursuing an education? Who says that you can't get married and build your life together? Who says that you can't get married and build your careers together? Who says that you can't get married and, right? Who comes up with this nonsense? If all this is rooted in two-parent households, how about people just learn to make better decisions with who they procreate with so that we have more two-parent households? And a majority of these social ills will be solved.
People don't tend to want to get married at 22 when they've just finished college, when they don't have the money to move out and they can't afford a house.
If two people do move out and have roommates, oftentimes it's cheaper for them to get married, combine their incomes, and have their own place than for them to have separate places. That's something to think about. So if you were dating someone and they got a roommate and they got their own place and they got to pay, I don't know, $1,000 for to split a place, and then you got to pay $1,000 to split a place, you could kind of just combine that by getting married and decrease that. Now, I'm not just saying you just go get flippantly married. I'm just saying when I'm thinking about it, like that makes more sense. This is why people cohabitate, right? Oh, we're gonna save money on rent, or you could have just got married instead of living together and pretending to be married.
Because we have changed the moral status of marriage in the culture, meaning that everyone, poor, rich, and in between, used to get married. By the way, a huge percentage of marriages in the United States used to be what they would call shotgun marriages, meaning that somebody knocked somebody up, and because they did not want the baby to be born outside of a two-parent household, they would then get married.
Do we think that shotgun marriages, though, are a way to bring back equilibrium to education?
Yes. Yes.
Well, let's say this. Do we think that that's a reasonable direction that society would ever take? Or is this like...
Yes, it was the reasonable direction for nearly all of modern history.
But history moves in one direction, right?
Why?
Because of time.
He said, why? Why? Who says that you just got to be more reckless with who you have kids with because society is becoming more progressive? Who says this stuff?
And I don't think we've ever regressed social standards back to like, oh, well, let's go 100 years back and do things that, used to exist before.
That's weird. The entire left right now is arguing that we regress social standards by rejecting Roe versus Wade. So that's obviously not true.
The Roe versus Wade is not a social standard. It's a Supreme Court ruling, number one. Number two, if you read the actual majority of opinion on Roe v. Wade, we can see that socially we actually never made huge progress on how society viewed. This has always been an incredibly divisive thing, right? Even that was, I think, part of Alito's writing on it was that things like gay marriage, for instance, we've kind of moved past and it's not really as debated anymore, but abortion was never a settled topic despite Roe v. Wade.
The notion that the arc of history constantly moves in one direction is belied by nearly all of the 20th century.
So Ben's argument is that society doesn't just progress and go one way. Look at all the crazy things that happened. And those were regressive things. And Destiny is saying, oh no, the Industrial Revolution, right? So morally, things have regressed and they can get better and they can progress. The trends in terms of what's happening in society right now, culturally, people are actually growing more conservative. Shockingly enough, these are real shifts that have happened.
Your suggestion is that history only moves in one direction. And I'm suggesting that history does not only move in one direction, it tends to move actually back and forth.
Sure.
Yep.
I don't think that all of history moves in one direction. There are going to be wars. There are going to be times of peace. I think in general, we're more peaceful now than we have been in the past. But I think when we look at the way that people live their lives, I think that we tend to move in a certain direction socially. So when it comes to things like racism or when it comes to things like slavery or women's rights, I think that there are two huge things that probably aren't changing in the US. And one is access to contraception and one is women working jobs. I think that these two things are probably huge things that are moving us off of shotgun marriages or getting married very early on.
More highly educated people, as you were saying, tend to get married more. So if the idea is that women getting an education somehow throws them off marriage, it's the opposite.
Oh man, did you guys catch it? Did you guys catch how he caught him in that trap? You're saying that people who are more educated and more this and that they don't want to get, no, it's actually people who are more educated and make more, actually end up getting more married.
Is that actually, as you raise up the educational ladder, people tend to be married more than they are lower down on the educational ladder. If you're a high school graduate, you're less likely to be married than if you're a postdoc.
I agree with you, but that's because one of the biggest precursors to getting married is having like a level of economic stability. So as people get more educated, they obtain this economic stability, and then they're in a more comfortable position to explore more serious relationships.
There's another confound there. I mean, the confound is that people in stable marriages tend to be the children of stable marriages. And there's only one way to break that cycle, which is to create a stable marriage. And that is something that is in every
Come on, Ben.
One's hands. Again, this notion that it is somehow an unbreakable, unshatterable barrier to get married and have kids. Yes. I don't understand where this is coming from. Why?
It's coming from guys like Alex O'Connor, atheists who believe that you do not have free will, that you are who you are. Your feet are planted in cement. You're biologically hardwired. And if you just have a higher sex drive, you're just going to screw anything you could screw. You're going to have babies with multiple women. And you could do what you will, but you can't will what you will. That's where it's coming from. It's coming from a sense of fatalism. I don't know if Destiny believes in free will. Destiny's an atheist. I don't know if he believes in free will. I do know that that there is a correlation there, that not thinking that people can change will then position you to believe that we're just highly evolved animals in heat doing whatever our predetermined biological imperatives are.
The initial point was for school, if we can provide a minimum level of educational stuff for children, that'd probably be good. But when we retreat back to, well, it has to be the families that are fixed first, fixing families is a multivariate problem.
Listen, when it comes to the actual problem of education, what I object to in the political sphere, and this happens all the time, is everybody is arguing on top of the iceberg about how we can move the needle.
That's right.
0.5 percentage points, as opposed to the entire iceberg melting beneath them. And we just ignore that. And we pretend that that's just, sort of the natural consequence of things. The arc of history suggests that people are never going to get married again. Well, I mean, actually what the arc of history suggests, realistically speaking, is that the people who are not getting married are not going to be having kids. And what it also suggests, the people who are married are going to be having kids. And so the demographic profile actually over time is rather going to shift toward people who are having lots and lots of kids. The people who are more religious and getting married are having more kids. And so if you're talking about the arc of history shifting toward marriage, I would suggest that actually demographically over time, long periods of time, not over one generation, over long periods of time, the only cure for low birth rate is going to be the people who get married and have lots of kids.
I don't necessarily disagree with any of that. I think that there are good conversations to be had about people getting married because stable families produce stable children that are less likely to commit crime, that are more likely to go to school, that are more likely to be productive members of society, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that. All of that is true. It's just frustrating that sometimes when you bring up any problem, all of it will circle back to other things that makes it seem like we can't make any progress in any area without like fixing something.
In what way? I mean, I literally just told you that on the local level, I'm fine for people voting for air conditioning.
Yeah, but so for instance, on the local level, so for school funding is done, I think, generally per district. So what do you do when you have poor districts that can't afford air conditioner for their schools?
I mean, the idea there would be that presumably if the society, meaning the state, and I generally don't mean the federal state, I mean like the state of California, for example, decides that everybody ought to have air conditioning, people will vote for air conditioning, and that's perfectly legal. And I don't think there's anything morally objectionable about that per se.
Cool.
I also don't think that that's going to heal anything remotely like the central problem.
Sure,
and I think that what tends to happen in terms of government is people love arguing about the problems that can be solved by opening a wallet, and nobody likes to solve a problem by closing their
legs.
Sex life to one person, for example, or having kids within a stable religious community. Like the things that actually build society. The problems they want to look at are the problems that are solvable by government. And then all the problems they don't want to look at, which are the actual giant monsters lurking in the dark and not particularly solvable by government, are the ones they want to ignore and assume are just the natural state of things. And I don't think that's correct at all.
And I 1,000,000,000% agree. Government is not like the solution to broken families. That would never be the case.
And it's actually not the solution to education, depending on the kind of solutions that you're talking about. Some solutions, yes. Some solutions, no.
Yeah.
So
the only thing I'm looking at is, as I said earlier, just like these minimum threshold things where it's like, where can government make, because you mentioned marginal, which I think is a really good way to look at things. There's marginal cost and marginal utility to things where the first $1,000 per student you spend might give you a huge return, but the extra 20,000 after is just
I
a
think
waste
these are all
of money.
pragmatic discussions.
Sure, of course. Okay.
Actually, this is what we used to hash out in legislatures before they turned into platforms for people grandstanding. But yes.
Shout out to my man Chris. He said, I hate to address the elephant in the room, but Destiny has a consistent track record of getting washed by religious people in debates. I mean, Trent Horn, Ben Shapiro, Lila Rose. I would agree. I concur. I think that's a reasonable conclusion. We see, according to the Bible, that prayer is extremely important in terms of us being transformed from the inside out when we get aligned with God's will. For the Christians watching this channel, I want you guys to implement these spiritual disciplines in your day-to-day life. And the only way I've been able to do this consistently is through writing down my prayers in a prayer journal that does a few things. One, it allows me to reflect and come to God humbly and ask Him to move on my behalf. And two, it allows me to document my prayers, which ultimately help me remember the very things that I was praying for and see the hand of God tangibly in my life when He answers them. So I would urge you, consider writing down your prayers. It could be in a blank notebook. It could even be on your phone. Or you could check out the one I personally designed and used from my own quiet time and spiritual discipline that I think will be a huge blessing. It's the exact structure and system that I've used for years to pray and be more consistent in my spiritual disciplines. You can pick yours up today by clicking the link in the pinned comment below. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.